In the stillness of an ancient, frost-laden evening, long before meteorologists mastered the art of predicting weather via green screens and stern expressions, a tiny village nestled snugly in the valleys of northern Europe braced itself for the ominous sounds of another relentless winter. The townsfolk, clad in layers that would make an onion envious, were accustomed to weathering Mother Nature's icy temper tantrums. These humble beginnings mark the nascent era of what would eventually evolve into the winter weather advisories we know today. Our tale meanders into a time where evenings were serenaded by the constant clang of blacksmiths' hammers and the sweet aroma of porridge weaving its way through homes. This porridge, mind you, was hardly just breakfast food here. It moonlighted as plaster, insulation, and in desperate times, a lovely facial mask. Rumor has it that the phrase, "smooth as a baby's bottom," originated from one such porridge experiment gone marvelously right. Amid this quaint, if slightly porridge-splattered setting, the villagers placed their trust in Old Man Tiberius. Old Man Tiberius was the closest thing they had to a weather oracle, mainly because he owned the only pair of spectacles in town and could decipher ominous gusts from mere zephyrs. Tiberius was a retired sheepherder with a knack for discerning cloud formations while simultaneously recounting tales of a tempestuous youth spent untangling sheep from hedgerows. One evening, as Tiberius fiddled with his spectacles and adjusted his thermally ineffective woolen cap, a particularly fierce wave of snowflakes began swirling about him in a manner that seemed suspiciously choreographed by the wind itself. Gathering the villagers in the glow of the flickering firelight, Tiberius squinted at the sky with both suspicion and mild curiosity, uttering words that would become eternally etched in local folklore. "You might want to fasten those shutters." It turns out, fastened shutters would soon become treasured inhabitants' nighttime rituals, symbolizing the village's resilient spirit against the snow's whimsical yet fierce ambushes. The infamous snowstorm that arrived shortly thereafter transformed the landscape into a pure, untouched expanse of white. It was a spectacle unparalleled, where homes resembled exquisite, overbaked pastries, all crusty peaks atop snug, marshmallowy warmth below. As villagers awakened to this wondrous yet challenging sight, it became achingly clear that harsh truths of winter would no longer simply be relayed by folklore or carried along by chilling breezes. The invention, or rather the delightful mishap of experiencing winter weather firsthand, begged a more formal announcement system, and thus spurred the need for winter weather advisories, which at the time consisted of painted wooden boards posted outside the bakery that read, "Snow lots." While the storm raged on that day back in the village, Hall, a council of rather inventive thinkers assembled. Fueled by mead ladled generously and slightly burnt bread, they began brainstorming ways to predict such mighty storms with more precision and less surprise. Notably, their early attempts involved more metaphors about spoons in porridge and fewer references to actual meteorology. As the snow swirled gently around the shutters, now snugly fastened and stubbornly creaking against the tumult, the village found a peculiar peace in their newfound ability to anticipate nature's white embrace. Evening tales around the hearth took on an aura of pride as families marveled at how they had become a small cog in the great, spinning wheel of weather history. And so, dear sleepy listener, snuggled in your warm cocoon of covers, remember these tales of old when bravery meant more than just standing up to the cold. It meant creatively surviving it. As blankets swaddle you and dreams begin to weave through your consciousness, I invite you to imagine beyond the gentle sway of time. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. As the embers of our story begin to dim to a gentle glow, tuck in the sides of your mind and prepare for more whimsical adventures in history's grand tapestry. As the gentle snowflakes drift down outside your window, it's rather easy to romanticize the crisp winter air It stirs with memories of warm cocoa and the muffled crunch of boots against freshly fallen delight. But don't get too cozy now, for we're plunging into the tale of a winter so fierce even the most jubilant snowman would shiver his carrot nose right off. Allow me, with tongue firmly in cheek and quilted storytelling skills at the ready, to escort you back to 1888, a time when the only thought of a weather app might involve consulting a particularly shrewd-looking cow. This year, oh sweet snowbound year, marks the Great Blizzard of '88, also known as the Great White Hurricane, because calling it the pretty intense chill was clearly underselling it. Imagine, if you will, a time when bustling cities like New York and Boston thought themselves too sophisticated for Mother Nature's frosty pranks. Yet, she gathered her fluffy arsenal that March and swirled it with the mischief of 1,000 invisible imps. The blizzard was upon them with a crescendo of winds reaching up to a Lord of the Rings-worthy speed of 85 miles per hour. Buildings protested, standing shoulder to shoulder like giant dominoes daring the wind to tip them over. Beneath the powdery blanket, which was far thicker than Grandma's bedtime quilt, life slowed to an exquisitely sleepy pace. Snowdrifts accumulated faster than a house full of procrastinators could hem and haw their way out. Some peeked over the heads of even the tallest top hats. Mind you, always back when a man was as proud of his top hat as one might be of their ability to correctly pronounce Worcestershire. Yet within the flurry's embrace, the tales of heroism and ingenuity weren't buried so easily. As the swirling storm days seemed to stretch longer than a bad knock-knock joke, some folks took to crafting makeshift skis from fence rails. Yes, just picture it. Stately gentlemen and corseted ladies attempting a patriotic pastime of gliding gracefully past pothole-laden streets, or, in less fortunate cases, face first into the very potholes they sought to escape. Balance, much like organization in one's sock drawer, was elusive at best. Perhaps my favorite yarn from this chilly chapter involves the heroic Martha, a local schoolteacher. Her courage warmed more hearts than your coziest mitten. Seeing the storm's approach, Martha ensured her small, shivering students were safely bunkered in their quaint little schoolhouse. Ignoring conventional wisdom, which would have her stay put, she valiantly marched 20 miles, half of it in hip-high drifts, just to make sure parents knew their children were safe. I dare say, her bravery and resolve could put even the sturdiest postman to shame. As warmer days inevitably tiptoed in, thawing both ice and spirits, relief was in sight. Folks dug themselves out of more snow than that found in Olaf's wildest daydreams, and went about tallying the lessons learned, muttering something about needing to listen more closely to the local cow's advice next time. And where did all these snowy tales lead us, you ask? The grand idea of more formalized weather reports took shape, apparently to save both lives and particularly cherished top hats from meeting regrettable fates. Thus, weather advisories began their stately promenade into public consciousness, transforming vaguely descriptive forecasts like, "It might be quite brisk," into something more like, "Brace yourself, good folk. The chill of the north approaches. So rest here, nestled in your comfortable cocoon, while the story of weather warnings continues to brew like a piping hot toddy in a grandmother's stovetop kettle. Our journey into the wintry past shall lull you deeper into a world where even the wildest storms are paved with humor and resilience, setting the stage for a nap far cozier than any snowbank's embrace. Historians and dreamers alike often marvel at the pivotal snowfall of 1888, the spotlight-stealing blizzard that swept up from the plains like a frosty curtain, a grand performance, if you will, of Mother Nature's wintry theater. Ah, the perfect powder of winter that would make any skier swoon was a harrowing ordeal for the residents wrapped up in its unpredictable embrace. As the snowflakes fluttered down in dizzying clusters, a strange serenity settled over the land, as if a thick woolen blanket was tucking the world in for an unscheduled hibernation. Back then, meteorology was more art than science. Imagine trying to predict the weather by squinting at the horizon, bravely interpreting the shapes of clouds like a soothsayer reading tea leaves. There were no radars, no friendly weather apps with flirty icons telling you what to expect with a mere splash of color. No, they had the farmer's almanac, and if they were lucky, a neighbor prone to lofty exaggeration that could declare with unwavering certainty that a blizzard was coming because his big toe twitched. The storm in question, fondly, or perhaps fearfully, remembered as the Great Blizzard of 1888, brought walloping winds that furiously sculpted the snow into drifts reaching astonishing heights. Some said they were taller than the tallest tales told by the townsfolk. In fact, it's rumored that more than a few cunning raccoons were seen building makeshift snow caves, politely knocking on doors when the howling winds proved too much, even for their wily nature. The cities of the nascent United States, brimming with both optimism and soot from their cobblestones to their rooftops, were caught off guard. Places like New York City were ill-prepared for a weather tantrum of such proportions. The snowfall was measured in feet, not inches, eliciting resigned groans from local mathematicians who realized this type of conversion was not worth double-checking. Carriages were halted in place, their wheels enveloped by the relentless snow, leaving businessmen of the time stranded and forced to discuss investment strategies at length somewhere in the white abyss. Strangely enough, amid the daunting demands of the storm, there came a pause. It was as if the chaos sprouted a companionable camaraderie among the city's residents. Inviting strangers warmed each other's homes with tales of adventures turned misadventures. They ventured into the streets, albeit reluctantly, wrapped in layers, a fashion statement blending practicality with the unmistakable flair of looking like a babushka doll. Far underground, tucked beneath layers of ancient brick and burgeoning subways, intrepid inventors pondered new technologies. Some tinkered with rudimentary concepts of rail heating, and others thought of hot chocolate pipelines directly connected to cozy fireside tables. Alas, practicality would triumph, but not without nurturing whims of heated sidewalks and enchanted sleds that shot sparks of whimsy as they chased across the icy roads. Radio folks from the future would one day recount that this very storm served as a sculptor, chiseling out the drive to improve weather forecasting. From the delightful confusion came the earnest call for the inception of formal winter weather advisories. And you'll find it hard to believe, but bells rang out in celebration, not just for the relief of surviving the storm, but for the birth of a new era in forecasting, one that would someday feature sweater-clad meteorologists delighting in cloud formations, boasting thunderous names. As the storm subsided and the spring solstice nudged its way into the lives of those who had shared in its icy grasp, the small pleasures of life returned with newfound warmth. People emerged from their impromptu winter cocoons to find the quiet remnants of a land still cloaked in white, punctuated here and there by hopeful hints of green. The blizzard that had once seemed threatening now lay silently transformed beneath the gentle thaw of a promising sun. So as you tuck your weary spirit under the light layers of your own making, think of the adventurer citizens on their snow-shrouded streets and the camaraderie enforced by a common, although frigidly uncomfortable foe. Let the echoes of the past guide your dreams forward, for with every snowstorm, so too comes the promise of an inviting horizon that draws ever closer. But as dawn peels away the blankets of night, we shall turn our gaze to new wonders yet to unfold. In the deep, echoing halls of history, where time's whispers linger like an antique perfume, we stumble upon the plight of that infamous winter of 1709, a time when the world, it seems, had misplaced its thermostat, causing Europe to shiver under a particularly rigid blanket of snow and ice. This wasn't just any winter. No. This was the Great Frost, as they called it, with each snowflake acting like an extravagant exclamation mark on what surely was nature's tirade. Picture France in the grip of the biting cold, where King Louis XIV, famed for his Sun King glamour, found himself begrudging the absence of heated sunbeams in his otherwise gleaming palace halls. The legendary hairdos of his court, powdered and towering like a dessert that defied gravity, now appeared to shudder in the drafty castle corridors. King's Garden, usually a tapestry of flowers, lay dressed in the palest frost, a sort of minimalist artwork even the most avant-garde artists of Paris couldn't have fathomed. In England, the River Thames froze so solidly it became more than a mere inconvenience. It transformed into a veritable shopping promenade lined with stalls selling hot ale, which is, as any aficionado will tell you, perfect for thawing both tongues and troubles. There were ice games to be played, and artists crafted whimsical ice sculptures that could serve as nothing less than the most ephemeral jewels in winter's diadem. Of course, Londoners, with their penchant for merriment even amidst calamities, indulged in a frost fair, because why not make the best of harsh weather by engaging in commerce and festivities atop Mother Nature's frozen tears? Meanwhile, farther afield in Russia, the Tsar's chickens reportedly laid cubes instead of eggs, a claim I admit might be mildly cracked, but it paints a vivid picture, doesn't it? In this severe winter, even the most seasoned icemen found themselves in awe of how quickly their breath frosted the air, creating tiny clouds that seemed to join forces with the overcast sky. They say people even always began suspecting sinister frost sprites were responsible, mischievous beings with a rather unconventional sense of humor. The Great Frost held Europe in its icy embrace longer than any polite guest should. Daily life became an exercise in endurance, as frozen supplies lined cellar walls like relics of better harvests. Bread turned into something more suited for masonry work, and the thought of fresh produce became an echo of a distant, sunnier past. Early mentions of the term weather advisory whispered among the more scholarly set, suggesting perhaps it was time to formalize some form of communication about such troublesome matters, preferably before entire cities froze again. But amidst the chill, humanity's ingenuity blossomed. Captivating ideas sparkled like ice crystals in the winter sun. Enterprising folks created contraptions to harness warmth from every conceivable source, so that fireplaces roared with a satisfying, crackling defiance against the cold. Cunningly, layers of wool and fur became this season's must-have attire. From the humblest peasant to the loftiest noble, every man, woman, and child resembled nothing less than a plush, breathing, mobile heap of warmth. And as sleep threatened to lure those blanketed in countless quilts to dreamland, echoes of tales spun in hushed voices could be heard. Stories of snowy escapades, the vaunted frost giants of Norse lore rumored to have made an appearance, and how eventually, surely, the flowers would return. So let us tuck our thoughts snugly into the cozy confines of this frosty tale, casting an eye toward the flickering candlelight. It dances gently, brightening shadows that hold their secrets close. And perhaps, as we venture onward, we'll find ourselves contemplating not just how we weather the storms that come our way, but how we celebrate them when they bring us closer together under one snowy sky. With the crackling fire casting feathery shadows on cobblestone walls, let us whisk ourselves away to the year 1871, a time when weather predictions were as hit and miss as throwing dice in a windstorm. Here, in the vaunted halls of meteorology, we meet the valiant, though slightly baffled, pioneers of weather prediction. These sartorially starved scientists were wielding rudimentary gadgets that bore a closer resemblance to a curious child's playset than any modern meteorological instruments. In their pursuit of understanding the mysteries of atmospheric behavior, they created the imperiously titled Signal Service, the world's very first weather office. Who could have guessed that men in cravat ties and waistcoats would be the ones to coin the phrase, "We might get some weather tomorrow," a groundbreaking declaration in their time. These were the very same individuals who would one day create the first ever winter weather advisory. And what moved these grand eyewear aficionados to issue such an advisory, you ask? It involved snow, lots of it. Picture yourself on a fierce December morning where a blizzard rages with such ferocity that the world outside is transformed into a vast, blank canvas, not unlike the tottering abyss of a snow globe shaken by a particularly enthusiastic ferret. The citizens of this era, bundled against the relentless cold, had to summon courage by the bucketful just to step out for the morning paper, or rather, the morning quill. Within this picturesque chaos, there emerged an unlikely hero, a man named Sergeant John P. Finley. Now, Sergeant Finley was not your average mustache-twirling officer. With a passion for weather as deep as his collection of woolly socks, he took it upon himself to outwit these biting blizzards. His mission? To craft a system capable of warning folks about incoming storms before they found themselves knee-deep in snow, with one foot proverbially stuck in the past. Thus began Finley's noble quest to dispense advisories ahead of blizzards, ensuring that each household knew to retrieve their trusty sled from the attic in preparation for what was colloquially known as deep freeze fun. Yet humor was never far from the surface. As Finley endeavored to predict the unpredictable, many a hearty chuckle could be heard from behind parlor doors as townsfolk, in their powdery panic, mistook livestock for one another amid the blinding snow. Over time, the winter weather advisory, in all its rhyming, lyrical glory, began to wind its way into the vernacular of every shivering soul. Each gained a newfound appreciation for timely alerts, crafted with a flair for the dramatic, mind you, rather like the saga of Shakespearean epilogues meeting almanac horoscopes. Sergeant Finley himself could not avoid the slapstick comedy of life as he learned, rather spectacularly, that predicting the precise nature of snowstorms often compared to entirely missing a tightrope walk with snowshoes. His attempts were marked with farce, such as forecasting a light frost, when in reality, the icy embrace of a blizzard would encircle the town in a grip worthy of a dormant ice dragon's sneeze. This was a time when communication speeds were languid, dragged down by steam-powered locomotives and wind-whipped telegraphs. Despite these slow-moving communications, Finley and his ilk persisted, mastering the fine art of tapping wires like Morse code maestros conducting dueling orchestras. There, amid the swirling chaos of snow-swept fields and the take-a-guess chronicles of weather predictions gone slightly awry, our cozy little narrative brings you to the threshold of dreams as we gradually drift forward in time. Listen closely, as if the quiet rustle of pages could speak, guiding you gently toward the mysterious lore of ensuing times, when advances in weather forecasting pranced closer to reality and even unfurled the unforeseen secrets within each flake of snow. Welcome to our dreamy delve into the chronicles of chill as we take a snow-dusted walk down the drifts of time. Picture this. The year is 1888, and as if out of whimsy's wintry imagination, something quite extraordinary is afoot, or should I say, as now. A connection quite unforeseen between Mother Nature and the telegram office is about to precipitate the very first winter weather advisories. In this captivating scene of snowflakes and telegram wires, we find ourselves in the northeastern United States, a region blissfully unaware of the tempest just beyond the horizon. Better known as the Great Blizzard of 1888, this frosty fiasco refused to simply be a garden-variety snowstorm. Oh no, it aspired to be the ultimate diva of snow, complete with gusty entrances and quite a lot of cold shouldering. Let us set the stage. It's March, and while most are anticipating the tender emergence of spring, the sky had other plans. No chubby groundhog had foreseen this elemental ambush. Even the wisest of owls would have tilted their heads in bewilderment. At approximately 40 inches of snowfall, this storm was nothing short of a whiteout concert, with howling winds reaching crescendo speeds of up to 70 miles per hour. Our story unfolds in the streets of New York City, where pathways transformed into treacherous tundras and the tallest of horse-drawn trolleys found themselves in perdition under piles of the cold kisses. Pedestrians who had ventured out were suddenly enrolled in a spontaneous event, aptly named the Survival Shuffle. It's the kind of weather that makes you question your life choices of leaving a heated hearth in pursuit of the brisk outdoors, or as they might phrase it, a blizzard is nature's way of keeping people indoors and seated by the fire. In candid Victorian style, folks attempted with great aplomb to continue their daily merriments. Hats off, quite literally, to those sir and madam brave enough to perform swift sidesteps while sharing the same umbrella, or perhaps human icicle, in the relentless gusts that aspired to topple them. Snapshots of life included children excitedly building phalanxes of snowmen, each one a sentry against the oncoming frosty siege. Yet the true warriors of the storm were the telegraph operators. Imagine them, fixing their spectacles and huddling around flickering machines like diviners around a crystal ball. Armed with nimble fingers and a penchant for brevity, they inked messages to the wider world, cautionary tales that acted as early winter weather advisories long before television forecasters donned puffy ski jackets. Communities banded together, sharing food and firewood, their melodies of camaraderie cutting through the blustery cacophony. Humanity, with all its hilarious foibles, continued to shine brightly, much brighter, some might say, than the frozen landscape's glacial glitter. Meanwhile, weather instruments, likely under significant duress, diligently recorded the event, possibly grumbling in Morse code about this unprecedented nuisance. But as every symphony finds its coda, so too did the snow stop its incessant fall. The world outside blinked cautiously into the post-blizzard sunlight, like an artist admiring a blank, albeit somewhat disorderly canvas. The air, remarkably still, carried a kind of hushed enchantment, as though Mother Nature herself was catching her breath. As nights passed and temperatures began to cozy up from Arctic to simply chilly, stories of this meteorological masterpiece warmed conversations by hearths all across the land. With each retelling, citizens of yore recognized the need for a formal warning system to help prevent such wintry woes from blindsiding them in the future. And thus, as dreams of those long ago drifted comfortably into slumber, they carried the seeds of a brighter, warmer day. A day when one could peek out the windows without surprise to say, "Ah, here's another day. We won't get snowed by weather again." Join us as the skies clear and the tale meanders into the sunrise of new predictions, whispering of the next chapter in nature's complex and amusing dance. As night blankets the cozy world with its serene glimmer, we unfurl the pages of history to find ourselves in the midst of a peculiar winter setting of yore. Imagine, if you will, a time when swirling snowflakes held the power to confound even the wisest sages of the land. A time when people gazed skyward, bewildered by the icy phenomena that seemed to defy logical explanation. Picture this: an ancient town square where a group of villagers gathers, cloaked in bundles of wool and animal hides, to discuss the latest bewildering development, the weather. It was the quintessential backdrop for a historical dramedy, as farmers, scholars, and the occasional wandering minstrel gathered in the tavern, for warmth, obviously, exchanging hushed rumors of the pending Arctic onslaught. Did anyone understand the true nature of the chill that prickled their noses and painted the world in white? Not entirely. Some would say these were the first winter weather advisories, albeit delivered more like enthusiastic warnings from your overly dramatic Aunt Mildred than scientifically informed announcements. Humanity, naturally prone to name things it finds terrifyingly fascinating, soon devised a term for this rare spectacle: the white shenanigans of the heavens. As fanciful as it sounds, perhaps the more poetic, if not exaggerated, descriptions were simply born out of a collective need to add a touch of flourish to something as mundane as cold air. Yet every tale told in front of a crackling hearth grew taller and taller with each retelling. "I tell you," said old Franz, the local historian known for his flair for theatrics, "the snow was so deep last year that even the chickens took skis to stretch their legs, and in a curious twist that only history can provide, as the wind's chill stung the faces of unsuspecting townsfolk, the art of meteorology in its most primitive form was budding. It was here, amid the freezing puffs of breath that mingled with steam from pots of peppery stew, that the seeds of our modern weather alerts were planted. An anxious villager might have shouted, 'Snows are coming,' which, loosely translated, meant, 'Prepare thy sled, for the world is about to go white. To add to the excitement, the night skies often played tricks on the sleepy eyes of the populace. When not mistaken for ominous portents of freezing doom, the colorful auroras twirling above were sometimes viewed as the ethereal dance moves of winter spirits, possibly improvised when inspired by the celestial currents. One villager might recall an occasion when he claimed to have seen a moose-like constellation guiding snowflakes to earth like a maestro conducting a symphony. A magnificent spectacle, no doubt, though one that only grew in grandeur after a tankard, or 3, of the local cider. The snowstorms, however, were more than artistic musings. These natural cold fronts, as bewildering as the expression on a cooked cabbage, threatened livelihoods and more than occasionally sought to challenge the resolve of those braving the winter landscape. Necessity became the mother of invention, with enterprising blacksmiths creatively crafting metal snowshoes, while bakers found fame by fashioning bread loaves that doubled as emergency fuel sources when set alight. Yet the notion of an official advisory was rather novel still, and perhaps came from an unofficial but wise consensus that to beat winter, one must first embrace it, with layers upon layers of wool wrapped tightly as if in a grandmotherly hug. Thus, wisdom was passed along from generation to generation, knitting communities together in shared burdens and woolen attire. With this little jaunt into the annals of frosty bemusement behind us, let's gently tread forward, as if on tiptoe across a snowy field, to uncover more of history's cozy mysteries. Rest assured, dear listener, the Iyas, night sky remains quiet sentinel to our slumberous endeavors, while tomorrow promises yet another chapter in our whimsical winter expedition, as our journey through history sways gently like a hammock in a soft winter breeze. We find ourselves glimpsing into a frosty epoch. Picture this. It's the early 19th century, and you're in the burgeoning hustle of New York City. The streets are alive with the clip-clop of hooves and the distant sound of blacksmiths' hammers ringing like a tinny symphony. But as winter's icy breath arrives, the city prepares for what would be an unwelcome guest, the snowstorm of February 1831. Now, it's important to note, this wasn't just any snowstorm. No, this was the meteorological equivalent of a debutante overstaying her welcome at the ball. With a snow cover so thick, it rendered valet parking for your horse-drawn sleigh utterly hopeless. The blizzard was so fierce that it became the talk of the town, and across the cobbled avenues, the only twinkling lights were not stars, but rather the tips of flickering candles flickering through frosted window panes. Now you might wonder why I've dipped my quill into this particular snow-laden inkpot, but bear with me. This blizzard was rather special. For you see, this wasn't any ordinary weather squabble. This blizzard triggered the first known winter weather advisory. Quite unlike today's neat officiousness, imagine residents responding to alerts that suspiciously resembled a tearful, "What do we do?" penned by some brave soul tasked with such a noble deed. Richard G. Howe, New York's blend of a disaster manager and town crier of sorts, was the mastermind. He took it upon himself to issue a blizzard bulletin, a term coined after realizing nobody in their right mind would leave their homes if they truly understood what awaited outside. Icy moats and mountains made of frozen fluff. The genesis of these advisories was more than a mere printed pamphlet. Howe ensured it was a performance. He stood in the center of town, clad in a rather impressively inappropriate attire for the cold, an oversized bear fur cloak and the kind of jaunty hat that seemed to imply he was a man torn from the pages of a lurid novel. And he bellowed his warnings as the snowflakes settled on his whiskers, transforming him almost into Father Christmas, if Christmas meant stay inside or else. The snowstorm itself could have inspired entire operas of lament. Somewhere amid the chaos, local lore whispered of a baker named Eliza Brumble, a woman of robust constitution with a taste for adventure. As she jaunted out to deliver sweet pastries to an inn across town, a mission she referred to heroically as bringing Bavarian joy to the cold, she discovered not only drifting snow, but also the unfortunate reality that one doesn't simply waltz through 8 feet of Mother Nature's stubbornness. Eliza, with her grit, survived to tell the tale, warning future generations never to wrestle a winter's wrath with marzipan truffles. Yet it's in the telling of these tales where the snowstorm's legacy finds its charm. This was a time when simply getting through the winter was a communal effort, akin to a society-wide winter pageant. There were makeshift sled races and families huddled together, knotting old quilts and sharing bracing tales of their bravest blizzard endeavors. Everyone became armchair meteorologists, predicting the weather with a sense of flair only a metropolis crowd could muster. All in all, the snowstorm of 1831 did more than blanket the city. It blanketed folks in a collective spirit of resilience and a flair for theatrics more fitting of a curious confederacy than a city. Of course, Howe's early advisories might not have forecasted with precision, but they marked the charming precedent of municipal melodrama that paved the way for the weather reports we know today. As we drift forward, painting tales upon this snowy canvas, let the lesson of this icy play remind us. It's often within the storm's ferocity that we find the warmth of camaraderie. Prepare to turn the page delicately as our journey meanders into another frosty chapter, revealing secrets yet untold. In the heart of a winter dance, where snowflakes pirouette to the rhythm of an invisible orchestra and the air feels crisp enough to bite without a chaperone, we find ourselves traveling back to a particularly storybook day in the mid-1800s. The stage is set in New England, where even the trees are dressed in their finest white, like debutantes at the annual snowflake cotillion. At the time, winter had an alarming habit of showing up unannounced. One moment you'd be sipping a steaming cup of something that pretended to be coffee, and the next you'd catch sight of a neighboring barn casually skating past your window. Intriguingly, what we now expect as part of our weather forecast, that ominous chance of snow, was as exotic and mysterious then as alpacas in the Arctic. It was a world devoid of winter weather advisories, which left everyone from school children to sailors playing an eternal game of seasonal Russian roulette every time the sky turned grey. Enter the protagonist of our chapter, a certain Mrs. Agatha Penderwick. Agatha ran the only general store within a day's horse ride, a creaky sanctuary filled with everything from pickled vegetables to homemade remedies stamped with dubious efficacy. But alongside these, she peddled something far more valuable, the village's very own snow oracle. With a bright kerchief tied over her voluminous curls and eyes sharper than a nor'easter wind, she possessed an uncanny ability to predict snow's arrival simply by the manner in which her pet cat, Archibald Sir Snugglesworth III, sneezed. Archibald, of course, had no scholarly training in meteorology, but his knack for pre-storm sneezes earned him, and by extension Agatha, a quaint fame that in those days almost rivaled that of a seasoned almanac. It all started when, one blustery afternoon, Archibald launched into a sneezing fit that disrupted a shelf of canned beets. Within hours, the horizon began to smudge with the unmistakable blur of a snowstorm. Such was the accuracy of Archibald's nasal predictions that when he sneezed thrice, the villagers would immediately launch a campaign of strategic firewood acquisition and vigorous cocoa sipping, bracing for the oncoming blizzard. In this era of unwarranted weather confidence, villagers would gather cozily around Agatha's counter, waiting for insights with an anticipation usually reserved for a royal parade. "How many today, Mrs. Penderwick?" a hushed voice might inquire, to which Agatha would calmly report, "2 big ones and a wheeze on the tail end." It may seem quaint, perhaps even a touch humorous, that forecasting winter's wrath depended on feline nostrils, but one must admit the enterprise was almost foolproof in its low-tech. A genius. Certainly, there were occasional mistakes, like the time Archibald caught wind of the pepper barrel instead of the storm, leading to a truly embarrassing false alarm. That day saw a somewhat anticlimactic village picnic under brilliant sunshine, seasoned lightly with a dusting of paprika. Despite such hiccups, the villagers adored their makeshift meteorological partnership. Agatha's method predated even the most primitive weather balloons and was considerably more reliable than the cranky weather vanes. which seemed intent on mimicking drunkards more than meteorological instruments. In a land of unpredictable forecasts, Agatha and Archibald were the guardians, the calm in every tempest. As the winter months drifted on, blanketing the pastures and forests alike, Agatha's homegrown advisories gained infamy, so much so that word of this uncanny duo reached publications beyond New England. Reporters, bundled in every available garment, risked the snowy terrain to witness the sniffling spectacle for themselves. Accounts of the sneezing storm cat graced several journal oil lamps, ensuring Agatha's name would endure long past the melt of snow. But as reliable as Archibald's predictions were, even he could not halt the inevitable march of progress. In time, scientific methods and the marvels of nascent meteorological technology would edge closer, whispering promises of barometers and telegraphs. As our chapter draws to its close, let us gently tiptoe away, leaving Agatha and her whiskered oracle amidst softly falling snow. Their little weather sagas would glide quietly into history, each flake a memory of the days when seasons danced to the tune of a resplendent sneezing cat. And so, like the last of winter's chill melting into the fresh promise of spring, we leave this enchanting chapter. Onward we glide, towards the next adventure beneath these whispering winter skies. As the snowflakes sandwich themselves between the pages of history, it must be acknowledged that not all blizzards are created equal. Our journey swirls us back to the year 1888, the time of the Great Blizzard, Mother Nature's icy rendition of an opera for the ages, an extravagant display of snow and wind, the likes of which weren't seen again until someone left the freezer door open during a family reunion. You see, dear listener, New York City had never encountered quite such a snowflake symphony before. Up until this point, the Big Apple had been mildly irritated with regular snowfalls, perhaps the equivalent of a cold sneeze. But in March of that year, the blizzard of '88 cranked up the drama, blanketing parts of the Northeast with up to 50 inches of snow and gusts whipping around at nearly 60 miles per hour. Now, using an analogy even a hibernate-bound bear could appreciate, let's just say it was less of a winter wonderland and more of a winter pandemonium. For the unsuspecting residents, the rabbit hole of inconvenience deepened. The blizzard brought about changes, big ones, small ones, and ones that lurked like stray socks under your bed. Public transportation froze better than yesterday's leftovers, and the burgeoning metropolis ground to a halt. Telegram wires, which up to that point had been the prime gossip channels, lay testaments to the dangers of sticking a taut wire out in the cold. Imagine the kerfuffle when the streets became more snowbank than avenue, and citizens were suddenly ushered into an unplanned winter hibernation. Many a gentleman was seen swapping their top hats for makeshift shovels, although deep down, they probably wished for a cup of cocoa and a fireplace instead. This blizzard was no respecter of people or punctuality, and it brought home the pressing impatience of Mother Nature when she feels ignored. The humor, of course, reveals itself not in the dire impact, but in the human spirit. Like penguins huddling for warmth, communities banded together with neighbors checking on one another and ensuring that the human body stayed part of active history rather than becoming a snowman relic. Horses, too, joined this peculiar camaraderie, their noses poking through drifts, perhaps wondering whether sleigh rides were really all that romantic. Now, let's sprinkle in a pinch of historical trivia, one known only to the most dedicated of snowy sleuths. It was moments such as these in 1888 that led to significant changes. The events that played out on those frigid streets prompted serious thoughts about placing vital city infrastructures, like trains, safely underground where icy whispers could not reach them. Thus, the dream of subways began to unthaw in the minds of city planners, lending a hand to commuters who could no longer endure a snowstorm's proverbial elbow in the ribs. Our tale wouldn't be complete without acknowledging the people who bravely trudged through ice and wind to deliver the first winter weather advisory of sorts. Newspapers. Yes, those trusted news vendors, with their ink-stained fingers and determined faces, played Elijah with editions dedicated to caution and preparation, battling snow with headlines that shouted, "Warning, streets ahead may have river-like snowdrifts." As you nestle deeper under your covers, the legacy of this blizzard continues to shape the way societies prepare for the fickle whims of winter. The tales from these years serve as a tapestry, a mix of frozen stitches that remind us to respect nature's erratic artistry. Now let's imagine our sleepy snowflakes drifting down to rest, so we might meander dreamily into future chapters, where more secrets of history lie waiting to tickle our curiosity and lull us deeper into slumber. As the harsh winter of 1717 settled over New England, the winds howled, and the skies decided to test their hefty, snow-filled baggage quite theatrically. Historians would later dub these wintry deeds as the Great Snow of 1717, a snowstorm so fierce it should have had its own Broadway show, complete with an ensemble cast of flakes dancing delicately to Mother Nature's cue. Picture this: New England farmers waking up to what seems like the sudden disappearance of the outside world, their barns buried somewhere beneath a confectioner's sugar dusting, just a tad excessive. The snow was so incredibly deep that calling it deep feels like an injustice, as if you were trying to describe Vivaldi with a kazoo. In fact, reports of snowdrifts reaching up to 25 feet render the term winter wonderland both accurate and painfully insufficient. If you had any plans in 1717, you'd have been safer penciling in, dig out until spring. Now, let us wander over to the small-town gatherings of the time, where villagers might have been just as concerned with what socks to wear as they were with the pragmatic issue of needing to excavate their neighbors. Community spirit was rather essential in these days of endless white. This was a time when social networking meant finally admitting your curiosity about your neighbor's dietary choices. Do you prefer fowl or a nice warm stew once we find the table under that snow heap? People, with a resilient spirit born out of sheer necessity, managed to navigate this baffling landscape using mostly trial, error, and well, slightly more error. Tales emerged of families digging tunnels through the snow to reach livestock, like a misplaced game of whack-a-mole with existential stakes. With roads buried and travel rendered as effective as attempting to waltz with a walrus on a tightrope, New Englanders realized that they were indeed in it for the long haul. The ministers of the day, ever the gallant jesters of divine commentary, noted that the storm was a message from above. Though, considering the clergy's attire at the time, many likely spent a majority of sermons pondering how to keep their fingers, both for gesturing and maintaining a firm grip on a steaming mug of mulled cider. They might have alluded to biblical floods, conveniently skipping over the fact that Moses, historically, had to contend far less with snowbanks than his New World counterparts. In this swirling winter narrative, it's important to bring in some cheeky protagonists. Enter the colonial children who, with boundless imagination and a strong immunity to adult concerns, saw no snow prison, but rather nature's most expansive playground. Toboggans emerged as the vehicles of choice, at a time predating the Department of Snow Travel Safety, transforming entire town hills into tracks that would put modern-day ski resorts to shame. While the elders lamented buried fences and snow-heavy roofs, these young adventurers went about harnessing sled dogs and constructing fantastical forts in ambitious attempts of territorial snowclaim. All fair play until bedtime struck, when arms were too weary from snowball battles to resist whatever folklore tales accompanied the flickering hearth's flame. Those early nor'easters undoubtedly laid the groundwork for what we might now ironically refer to as weather advisories. Unbeknownst to them, their stoicism and creative snow-slogging would set the precedent for modern-day acknowledgements of Mother Nature's frosty fury. It's a thought that warms the heart more than mulled wine on a frigid evening. As the great snow of 1717 settled timelessly into history's snowdrift, those who endured it learned a valuable lesson. When life hands you landscapes of endless white, embrace the coziness and prepare for one rather extended game of hide-and-seek with spring. Now, while our sleepy eyelids begin to cloud with the mist of dreams, we saunter ever smoothly into tales of farther shores, where similar adversities were met with equally resilient and spirited communities. But let us save those slumber-inducing adventures until after we've basked a little longer by the glow of this comforting hearth. In the frosty heart of the 19th century, when snowflakes pirouetted without restraint and winter had no manners to speak for itself, there emerged a legendary snowstorm so bold that even Mother Nature took a step back to admire her handiwork. It was during such a snowy revolution that humanity began to think that perhaps, just perhaps, some kind of warning system might be in order. Something that would boldly suggest, hey, you might want to wrap your scarf a little tighter tomorrow. The infamous storm of 1857, which swept across the northeastern United States and devoured everything from fence posts to reputations, brought about more than just the blushing of cheeks. It introduced the concept of the first winter weather advisories. Townsfolk who once believed that layers of snow were merely the clouds giving the earth a warm hug began to reconsider their stance. Dreams of cozy firesides, complemented by endless cups of hot cocoa, started to dance alongside thoughts of surviving in the frigid wilderness. During this particularly historic blanket of white, we find ourselves in the small town of Snugsville, a name most certainly chosen to mock its inhabitants' constant struggle to stay warm. Snugsville had all the hallmarks of a quintessential sleepy little town. Quaint cottages buried beneath snowdrifts, townsfolk bustling in layers that made them resemble overstuffed pepper pots, and of course, one perplexed meteorologist by the name of Horatio Flufflebum. Horatio, with his rather large spectacles and a weakness for woolen socks, was not your typical man of science. One might say he was a bit too keen on observing how snowflakes, each with its own unique design, seemed determined to fashion the world into a winter wonderland, a fact made somewhat inconvenient when one is attempting to shovel the path to one's door. Horatio had, for years, been issuing suggestive advisories, which were, in essence, kindly worded notes, such as perhaps a second layer might not go amiss on the "tomorrow," which he slid under the doors of concerned townsfolk. No one truly heeded his advice, attributing his dedication to the romantic whimsy of an overzealous weather enthusiast. But one particular morning, as dawn cracked open like a cold egg, Horatio stumbled upon the day of his meteorological dreams. He awoke to find the entirety of Snugsville buried under a snowstorm so immense that it assumed legendary status by lunchtime. The storm, which embraced being the talk of the town by bringing not just snow, but the kind of ghastly winds that find every crack in one's armor, presented the perfect opportunity for Horatio to test his advisories on a grand scale. In a moment of improvisational brilliance, fueled by determination and 3 cups of very strong tea, he composed his very first official alert. Stay indoors unless you fancy becoming an icicle's doppelganger. Much to his delight, and perhaps surprise, the townsfolk heeded his humorous yet somewhat ominous "sin warning." The realization soon dawned that Horatio's jests held valuable truths behind them. As folks huddled inside their small, snow-cocooned abodes, piecing together giant jigsaw puzzles and revisiting the somewhat neglected art of conversation, they began to discuss the odd notion of granting a few degrees more respect to their local weatherman. Secluded in their frosty retreat, individuals found new ways to keep warm and occupied. Knitting circles were formed where members exchanged whispered tips on revolutionary adjusting stitch methods integral for producing socks that went right up to one's chin. Resilient families gathered around fireplaces to spin tales passed down through generations, finding warmth in the ancestral yarns as much as they did in the firelight. And so, Horatio's legacy grew. His advisories, peppered with gentle humor, achieved a considerable following. Over the following winters, as the nation saw fit to codify these advisories into a formal process, acknowledging that nature was not only whimsical, but occasionally downright bossy, Horatio's prestige as an invaluable guide to surviving winter's whims blossomed. Even his fanciful suggestion of communal snowball festivals, strategically designed to keep spirits buoyant, caught on, marrying practical weather advice with jesting charm. So, as Snugsville drifted into either the next glorious snowstorm or a cozy slumber on cozy clouds, Horatio secretly enjoyed the adulation. After all, it wasn't every day that one inspired the world to sandwich seriousness between layers of humor, proving that sometimes the coldest minds and warmest hearts create the most memorable legacies. And with that, let's prepare ourselves to explore the transformation of snow-immersed townsfolk into winter weather aficionados as the story begins to move toward even colder realms, as the shadows of a long, chilly evening stretched lazily across the rugged, white expanse. It almost seemed like winter had hung a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the year's revolving door. In the 17th century, when snowstorms were enthusiastically ferocious, it should come as no surprise that the Northeast mystery, known as the Great Snow of 1717, cheerfully blew through town with its own public relations team, leaving quite the impression on history. Now, imagine, if you will, colonial New England, a quaint little snow globe of puritanical persistence, where folks often found themselves wondering if they had inadvertently moved to the North Pole. In February of that year, and for many weeks after, winter decided to drop by uninvited with 4 successive snowstorms, depositing more than 3 feet of snow in some areas. Life became the ultimate game of hide and seek, with everything from church steeples to nervous New Englanders disappearing under a shimmering white blanket. In these early days before meteorologists, predicting weather was more of an art than a science, although some might argue it still is. Cornelius Ashworth, a farmer with the temperament of a seasoned fortune teller, bravely attempted to read the sky. He'd declare, "The squirrels are stockpiling nuts. Something fierce. Expect a mighty fine snow soon," before suspiciously eyeing his own dwindling woodpile. As the snowstorms descended with the graceful flair of an over-enthusiastic prima donna, people innovatively coped with the challenges. Snowshoes, which looked like oversized tennis rackets for the feet, made every trip outside feel like one giant step for humankind. Far from mere practical garb, they ignited fashion trends reminiscent of early moonwalking, albeit with fewer sequins. Of course, churches in these close-knit communities inevitably became beacons of warmth, offering more comfort than Farmer Thompson's questionable moonshine. Yet, getting to church was another trial entirely. Intrepid congregants often tunneled through tunnels of snow, their piety tested by the hope that salvation indeed lay on the other side. Those who made it found themselves in lively discussion, not only of divine matters, but competing tales of survival and knee-depth snow, swap stories just as legendary as the church bells that rang above. Remarkably, the winter whiteout became a rallying point, complete with community-based snow removal efforts. Villagers chiseled away with moxie and muscle, forming alleys of passage atop colossal snowbanks and swapping tales of heroic shoveling achievements that seemed taller each telling, much like the snowdrifts themselves. It was around this time townsfolk began practicing their wit on one another, famously jesting, "Why did the chicken cross the road? To join the oxen and sleds stuck there since last Tuesday." Animals, too, became unwitting stars in this wintry saga. Dogs, universally bemused by the infinite sea of fluff, might be found piloting sleds piled high with necessities. Some livestock were not so lucky, with cows acting as bovine Swiss rescuers, a.e. peeking out from snow caves with expressions of bovine bemusement. These motifs, in snowshoed silhouettes against a whitewashed backdrop, farmer forecasts mirroring weather epics, and community gatherings blossoming with stories and shared struggles, are what tied the colonists together in an unanticipated fellowship. Despite the biting cold, there bloomed a genuineness of spirit, a quaint charm uniting them in shared hardships and sigh-inducing humor that inevitably warmed the soul. Even as winter's breath began to fade, with sporadic snowmelt trickling into hopeful rivulets, the legacy of the Great Snow lingered. Having forced a weather-conscious sensibility upon generations of New Englanders, the event whispered early lessons of weather preparedness. From underneath layers of powdery silliness, tales of resourceful community spirit emerged, still bustling warmth into hearth and heart. And so, as the last rays of a setting sun danced over the crystalline crust of that bygone frost, a folded chapter of hilarity, resilience, and camaraderie flickered to a close. Yet behind the gentle sigh of winter's retreat awaited another yarn, ready to unravel its treasures, inviting sleepy eyes and wandering thoughts to musings on triumphs of weathered certitude inscribed in the annals of time. As snowdrifts grew taller than the average frontiersman and icicles transformed barns into crystal palaces, the winter of 1888 strutted onto the historical stage dressed in its most beguiling yet lethal finery. It was as if Mother Nature had decided to host a grand ball of frost and flurries, inviting only the most resilient and foolhardy to the proceedings. Back then, the storm was christened with suitably reverent names, much like celebrity babies are today, and the Great Blizzard of 1888 was both an understatement and an exaggeration all at once. Picture, if you will, a time when winters were solely measured by how many layers of flannel your great-grandma was wearing that day. Long before the Weather Channel's earnest meteorologists warned us to bundle up, the northern United States was taken aback by this mighty blizzard's grand entrance. It was clear that the time had come for the first inklings of modern winter weather advisories, even if they were scrawled in shaky cursive on a chalkboard in the town square. As the snow piled high in New York City, no less than 55 inches in some places, several stout snowmen stacked shoulder to shoulder, the streets resembled Venetian canals minus the gondolas. Rather than romantic boat rides, locals navigated the vast snow labyrinths in makeshift tunnels created by industrious citizens armed with nothing but shovels and a good deal of misplaced optimism. Commuting became a contact sport. The elegance of lacy boots marred by slush resulted in a vibrant shoe cleaning industry, booming precisely when you least wanted to take your shoes off outside. Elsewhere, enterprising inventors, likely powered by a curious cocktail of boredom and homebrewed spirits, took to fashioning homemade snow melters from outdated pots and pans. The more ambitious among them toyed with the idea of flame-throwing sleds, quite possibly a distant precursor to the trusty snowblower, much to the alarm of their equally frozen neighbors. Despite such innovations, the quiet cities soon found themselves under a white, softly humming blanket, as crisply tucked in as any sleepy traveler heading off to the land of Nod. And speaking of travelers, their journeys were as peculiar as they were perilous. Steamship cronies weathered out whiteouts with blithe indifference. Dog sleds made some suspiciously brisk deliveries, and, continuing the long tradition of setting off at a moment's notice, armed only with a horse and a keen sense of direction, early adventurers stumbled upon a curious footnote in history, inadvertently defining the benchmark for future road trips gone awry. Meanwhile, in the heartland of New England, where winds could gossip your business from coast to pine, families gathered around hearths, forging legends over cups of warm cider and fantasies of Caribbean beaches. Oh, those poor dreamers. They sang ballads of palm trees while throwing another log onto the crackling fire, the only warmth beside the flickering light that kept the frost ghosts at bay. Miraculously, all these chill-ridden shenanigans quite literally paved the snowy path to the modern weather alerts we now receive with a casual swipe on our phones, springing from the simple facts laid bare by such colossal winters of yore, that wearing one's underwear over one's long johns does little against frostbite, and that perhaps batting down the hatches is a noble pursuit when the world turns into a monochrome sketch of Jack Frost's fever dream. Yet as the winds settled, gentling into lullabies on a peaceful March evening, the horizon held a promise of something less frigid, something of hope. Soon, hidden beneath layers of snow, life would slowly begin to murmur back into existence. Our sleepy adventurers, with frost-nipped noses and large mugs of burgeoning melodies, would ripen into raconteurs, though admittedly none could quite grasp why the storm brought with it 100 pounds of ice and the collective desire to relocate to warmer climes. The winter held sway with humorous dominion over the populace, a fitting performance to lull one into understanding the full cycle of seasons. As the last snowflake somersaulted to the ground, something stirred beneath, a soft tickle, a green hope. But now, let's save that gentle thaw and the crocus's tentative peak for another time. As the snowflakes settled gently over the small town of Worcester, a humble little dot on the icy expanse of Massachusetts, The air was imbued with a curious mixture of tranquility and impending mischief. The winter of 1717 was known for being notoriously unforgiving, a veritable virtuoso of frosty antics, where each flake seemed to fall with a particular sense of purpose, as if auditioning for the lead role in nature's winter wonderland. In a season remembered for its relentless onslaught of snowstorms, this blizzard acted less like a weather phenomenon and more like an uninvited houseguest who couldn't quite take the hint to leave. It was during this formidable winter that the first whispers of something akin to a modern winter weather advisory began to emerge, though, of course, it lacked the formalized title and the comforting nonchalance of today's gentle alerts. Instead, these advisories came in the form of shouted warnings from neighbors or hastily scrawled notes passed across tavern tables, sagely reminding folks to stock up on essential supplies, usually bacon, beans, and before long, a strong barrel of ale. Imagine, if you will, the scene in Worcester. Villagers bustling about with the urgency of squirrels preparing for a particularly dramatic hibernation, each family vying to gather enough wood to warm their hearths, which seemed but a distant dream under the smothering blanket of snow. Of course, there was always that one unperturbed villager, let's call him Elder Johnson, who insisted that the snow of his grandpappy's days was surely chest deep, if not higher. Naturally, this dubious wisdom was met with gentle eye rolls and knowing smirks from those busy trying to retrieve their snow-blanketed hens. It was indeed a time of close-knit survival, where snow days weren't an excuse for suburban sledding, but more an exercise in communal perseverance. Neighbors helped shovel paths that might connect them to the rest of the world, an act both noble and perhaps a bit self-serving when considering the allure of Mrs. Thompson's famous warming stew simmering just 2 cottages over. There was an unspoken camaraderie that bound the townsfolk together as they navigated the snowy peril. This companionship, though, was always tested by the deceptively simple challenge of identifying your horse in the stable once the blizzard's fury subdued. The spectacle of seeing Mr. Hargrove earnestly apologizing to Mrs. Whittaker for attempting to saddle her dear Clarence was but one of the many chuckles to be had when the swirling frosts caused such chaotic doppelganger confusion. And yet, amidst the flurrying snow and collective sigh of the assembled villagers, there resided a hidden beauty. The snow-tipped branches creaked melodically in the frosty breeze, while children, oblivious to the arbitrary challenges, crafted, misshapen, yet lovable snowmen that seemed to echo back their innocent giggles. It was in this simplest of activities that there blossomed the reminder of warmth beyond any wood fire's reach, a flame forged from shared experience, more potent than any winter's chill. Though much of life stopped as the snow did its best impression of an endless duvet day, the townsfolk demonstrated their remarkable adaptability. Evening storytelling gathered new attendees around roaring fires, where tales of old, featuring daring knights or wily scoundrels, charmed eager ears, and everyone, wrapped snug as could be, dreamt briefly of simpler, sunnier times beyond the reach of winter's touch. Each villager knew that the storm, like any tale told around a cozy hearth, would eventually pass, leaving behind a clearer, calmer sky and tales of blizzard-driven derring-do. It was the kind of winter woven into the very narrative of their lives, where teacups clinked, laughter echoed, and frost melted into folklore. But of course, as the snow found its stillness, and the voices of Worcester drifted snugly into the night, our tale dares not rest unfulfilled. Another chapter beckons quietly on the horizon, where history's tapestry unfolds anew, eager to blend whimsy with wisdom under a shimmering, snowy canvas. And with that gentle hint of curiosity, we leave our dear Worcester in the frosty glow of its peacefully slumbering night, as the last ember of warmth winked out in the hearths of years long past. Winter swept in with its icy breath, covering the world in a thick layer of dreams. In those days, when snow fell, with the determination of a novelist nearing a deadline, communities braced themselves for a chilly fiasco. Enter the year 1888, A year that danced its way into the record books with the grace of a polar bear on an ice sheet. Enter the Great Blizzard. The Great Blizzard of 1888, a snowstorm of epic proportions, was nature's way of proving that it was the boss of all things cold and white. It all began with an innocuous flurry, as these things often do, before puffing out its chest and unfurling into the greatest show of winter's theatrical capabilities. And oh, did it perform magnificently. With snowdrifts reaching the height of two-story houses, it looked as if an army of enthusiastic yet terribly careless cake bakers had laid siege to the northeastern United States. In New York City, the blizzard took on the character of an aloof artist, blanketing the streets with its white canvas, causing horse-drawn carriages to stumble and pedestrians to question their winter wardrobe choices. The city's elevated trains, a marvel of modern engineering at the time, found themselves enshrined in ice, clinking like a wind chime in full swing. Imagine trains so snowed in that they resembled frosty, failed soufflés. Commuters, clearly not amused, embarked on epic journeys home, some even sleeping overnight at their places of work, thereby inventing the world's first business sleepover. Meanwhile, farmers in the countryside adopted the stoicism of seasoned Viking warriors, battened down behind improvised snow walls, as the wind howled like a wolf denied a midnight snack. All the while, transportation from the steamboats to the humble ploughhorse found themselves ensnared, frozen in unwilling camaraderie. It seemed that nature had put her frosty foot down, commanding everyone to stay home and reflect on their life choices, or maybe just knit more socks. Amid this whirling snow globe, the situation in Washington, D.C. was equally absurd. The capital, graced with the presence of snow as eagerly as a cat graced with the presence of water, found itself defenseless against the cold's insidious advance. The weather left congressmen frantically flapping their wings, metaphorically speaking, as they tried to dig themselves out to reach their duties, or perhaps just their warm firesides. In other parts of the nation, candlelit households huddled, sharing stories of mammoth hunting expeditions fueled by the perilous conditions outside. Tales tossed around with all the seriousness required of an event where the indoor picnic officially became a thing. Children, blissfully unaware of the chaos, took to sledding and snowball fights, challenging the storm with little more than hearty laughter and red noses, as if winter's wolfish teeth were nothing more than an overgrown bunny. As the blizzard raged on, the nation, collectively, could do little more than bundle up and sigh heavily. Yet, from this snowy silence, an idea flickered. Perhaps officials should begin to warn people of such meteorological shenanigans beforehand. That, dear listeners, was the seed that would eventually blossom into those helpful winter weather advisories we know today. The surprise gifts you receive from meteorologists reminding you to both stock up and stay under the comfort of your wools. So, heralding from the frosty plains and snow-painted canvases of 1888's great adventures, let us draw the curtains of our chapters slowly, with a gentle reminder that what came hurled and swirling from the great blizzard would gradually shape our modern etiquette with the elements. As you lie comfortably cocooned beneath your blankets, ready for whatever whimsical corner of history tomorrow may bring, remember to thank those valiant souls of yesteryear, whose adventures in white became the calming lullabies of our present-day storms. And perhaps, just perhaps, you will drift quietly into dreams filled with soft snowfalls and cozy firesides as we gently turn the next leaf of history, as winter descended upon the quaint town of Emmental in the late 17th century. The local inhabitants began to realize that this year's frosty embrace was less of a gentle hug and more of a bear trap laced with a practical joke. The snow fell with the kind of determination usually reserved for disgruntled postmen on a Monday morning, and people were starting to wish they had invested in a pair of snow boots rather than continuing to rely on their trusty, thin-soled clogs. Emmental, famous for its heavenly cheese and cheerful cowbells, was facing a snowstorm of epic proportions. Now, if history has taught us anything, it's that when the weather takes a turn for the worse, humans get creative. And indeed, innovation was as ripe as a camembert left, out at room temperature. The town's most respected baker, Frau Helga, decided she would double her loaves. "Nothing keeps you warmer than carbs," she proclaimed with the assertiveness of someone who has experienced too many winters. She might have been onto something, netting herself a side hustle in improvised hand warmers after the bread went cold. With the swirling blizzard outside banning any possibility of leisure strolls, indoors was the new outdoors. The town's philosopher, a chap named Albert, took this opportunity to host gatherings that suspiciously turned into weekly existential debates about which came first, the chicken or the snowstorm. All the while, his house became the go-to spot not only for warmth and reflection, but also for the freshly mulled wine that seemed to appear every hour on the hour. As the snow mounted, reaching heights nearly equivalent to a young lad carrying 2 sacks of flour, the community banded together, because it turns out shoveling snow can be classified as a team sport if you try hard enough. As they uncovered their rooftops from nature's wintry prank, it was also an opportunity to hum the grand tradition of old tunes, consisting mainly of repetitive yodeling arrangements that allegedly kept the avalanche at bay and the spirits high. Meanwhile, the town blacksmith, Klaus, had realized his calling could serve a higher purpose. He fashioned shovels out of spare metal and wood scraps, and soon, everyone wielded one of Klaus's noble creations like a sword in the white abyss. His workshops echoed with the clamor of creation, an inadvertent rave where the main audio was the metronomic hammering against snow-laden adversity. Even amidst a blizzard of mythological proportions, humor found its way into every snow-covered cranny. The local apothecary, who was slightly hard of hearing, or maybe just hard of listening, concocted what he claimed to be a miracle snow-repellent balm. This was merely repurposed goose, fat with an extra pinch of thyme, resulting in townsfolk smelling suspiciously like roast dinner. However, the placebo effect alone seemed to warm many a cold heart. Of course, with every tale of struggle, there's an unsung hero. In Emmental's case, it was a 12-year-old named Hans who devised a sled for quick treks across the icy terrain. Strapping together old barrel slats with some of Klaus's metal remains, he created a method of transportation that not only brought supplies quickly, but also turned transportation into an activity that rivaled the thrill of a knight's joust. That is, if knights slid gracefully on their noble cheeks down slushy hills. Eventually, as all storms do, this one blew over. The heavy snow began to melt, revealing stacks of unsold bread loaves and little remindful puddles of melted goosefat balm. Yet Emmental was left warmer, not just from the physical drifts of snow finally being banished to memory, but from the binding camaraderie forged in adversity's frosted foundry. As the townsfolk stood under their bright, thawing sky, contemplating life's great mysteries, but mostly egging Albert on about how the chicken snowstorm debate became a real thinker, they collectively sighed and thanked their luck. Little did they know the wind was merely taking a dramatic pause to prepare for its next act, which, unbeknownst to them, would demand an even greater leap in wintertime folly and ingenuity. But for now, they listened to the rhythmic drip-drip of the melting snow, a lullaby leading them into a hopeful doze, comfortably coaxing the narrative forward into the whisper of tomorrow's possibility. As the howl of the wind quieted and the world settled into a frosty calm, we find ourselves deep in conversation with the illustrious Robert Fitzroy, who, perhaps surprisingly, was more accustomed to predicting rain showers than snowstorms. It was the 19th century, a golden era for being confidently wrong in the name of science, and Robert was as much a pioneer in this practice as any gentleman of his time. Fitzroy was an esteemed British naval officer and a pioneer in the field of meteorology. His enduring legacy would be in giving the British public something new to complain about, besides taxes and tea shortages, by inventing the weather forecast. Indeed, prior to Fitzroy, weather predictions were about as reliable as the fortunes inside a particularly stale cookie, but considerably less digestible. In those days, snowstorms had an aggressive habit of ambushing communities like unwelcome houseguests showing up for a dinner party you never planned. No one could predict the amount of snow falling, less a forecast and more a dramatic reveal. It was a time when looking out the window was far more reliable than any sort of scientific prognostication. But not to be discouraged, Fitzroy approached the task with the optimism and grit of a man who had once commanded ships sailing in all sorts of disagreeable weather. His toolkit was filled with instruments that would seem just as confusing to us today as they were back then. Barometers that often made the wrong kind of barometric predictions, and thermometers that rarely agreed with the one down the street. Yet, it was this ensemble of unpredictable gadgets that helped Fitzroy and his peers issue some of the earliest weather alerts, or at least strongly worded suggestions. One of the first winter weather advisories in history was akin to a neighborly note left on your doorstep. Less an exact science, more an educated guess wrapped in an envelope of hope. People began taking Fitzroy's forecasts with a pinch of salt, or perhaps, more appropriately, a shovel full of snow. Despite his best efforts, it seemed whatever Fitzroy said about the weather, Britain did the other thing. Fortunately for him, the weather is a forgiving beast, always willing to shake off today's failures for tomorrow's fresh debacles. Even with the unpredictability of science in its infancy, Fitzroy toiled away, sketching charts and broadcasting maritime warnings, sounding the alarm before tempests turned travel into terrain unless. His dedication to the craft helped not only avert countless seafaring disasters, but also birthed Britain's intense national pastime of grumbling about the weather. As the winters of the 1860s passed, Fitzroy's work started catching wind, pun intended, among the public, and despite his detractors, he began sowing the seeds of meteorological trust. Forgetting early missteps, yes, even the one that led to fish raining down on a bewildered coastal town, Fitzroy was, at heart, a man who longed for scientific respectability, even if it sometimes seemed to drift like an errant snowflake. By the time word of these predictive powers reached the common folk and laced through their winter stories, the legend of Fitzroy's forecasts had begun. Farmers who once threw caution and seeds to the wind now paused to consider just how blustery the moors would become the next day. And even those whose skepticism rivaled the charmingly unreliable British climate itself began to place some credence in learning if it was safe to leave the house without being pelted by uninvited snowballs. As Chapter 18 slips gently into night, imagine the scene. Fitzroy, peering through a frosty window, a warm cup of tea cupped between his weathered hands, pondering tomorrow's probable errors, but hopeful nonetheless. The work, though arduous, set the stage for future forecasts, enriching the lives of all who sought to avoid hypothermia at the bus stop. With newfound reverence for the art of predicting Mother Nature's whims, we drift softly toward the burgeoning promise of Chapter 19. Snuggle into your blankets and let the warm embrace of history gently tuck you in as we tiptoe into the tale of a snowstorm so monumental it made cows question their own existence. We're transported to the year 1888, a time when folks thought mega blizzards were just a harsh method of Mother Nature saying, "Go build a better winter coat." The Great Blizzard of 1888, so mighty it needed capital letters, pummeled the northeastern United States with all the subtlety of a tap-dancing moose. This legendary tempest burst into the collective consciousness in March of that year, catching everyone off guard like a pop quiz on a Monday morning. With winds howling at over 40 miles an hour, it was as if the heavens themselves had decided to host an impromptu wind festival. Unfortunately, nobody had bothered to send out invitations, and so New Yorkers weren't exactly on board with these ill-timed weather festivities. As the blizzard raged on, it was said that the snowdrifts piled so high that in some parts they offered a competitive vantage point for would-be rooftop snowball generals. People found themselves taking on brave new roles: sled captain, snow fort engineer, even chairperson of, why did I decide to leave the house today? Committee. Roles they hadn't quite aspired to, but embraced with a resilience characteristic of the times. With train services halted and most of New York City buried beneath mounds of white chaos, the blizzard didn't just inconvenience, it inspired the formation of the first inklings of something resembling the modern weather advisory system. People suddenly thought, wouldn't it be splendid if we knew these things were coming? Of course, in those days, the act of predicting the weather was about as reliable as consulting a pine cone for financial advice. Indeed, many meteorologists of the era armed themselves with little more than a barometer, a wistful look into the distance, and a prayer. The bewildered citizens of 1888 soon found themselves inventing new forms of winter camaraderie. Neighbors banded together to ensure that everyone was safe, fed, and sufficiently entertained. After all, everything, from school to work to most forms of transportation, was generously cancelled on account of the snow apocalypse. If Netflix and chill had existed, it would have been called Fireplace and Frostbite, with the programming content mostly centered around dramatic retellings of last Monday's sledding adventures. In the midst of all this, there was one unintended side effect: the invention of impromptu sidewalk salting. As the snow slowly slackened its grasp, New Yorkers threw caution and salt to the wind, attempting to clear paths to their favorite coffee place or simply their nearest neighbor. Little did they know, their efforts were the embryonic stages of future municipal salting operations, not to mention an unanticipated potassium chloride renaissance. One can't neglect the tale of a tenacious flock of sheep on the outskirts of the city who, much to the amusement of the local farmer, decided to form their own committee, the Society for Unreasonably Sheepish Behavior, determined to gather in every snow, drift they could manage. Ever the icons of stubbornness, they became the unofficial mascots of the storm, embodying the unwavering spirit that, much like these sheep, would weather any storm. As the storm eased and the clocks climbed upward towards springtime, there came a collective sigh from the populace, who were grateful to stop being mistaken for snowmen. The Great Blizzard of 1888 might have cowed a lesser city, but New York wore its frosty crown like a badge of honor. It taught generations the importance of picking the right footwear and eventually led to the contemplation of grounding trains underground, a revolutionary notion considering the visible tracks had been playing hide-and-seek all season long. So, with a light dusting of history under our pillows, we drift beyond the snow globe shakeup that was the Great Blizzard of 1888, leaning gently into the echoes of what would become a wiser, more weather-conscious era. Carry the warmth of this tale with you as we softly embark on our next whispered adventure into the snowy expanse of forgotten chronicles. As the chilling whisper of winter settled over Europe in the early 1700s, it was not uncommon for people to find their warm breakfast utterly frozen by the time they brought it to the table. One might wonder if this explains the curious rise in popularity of ice cream for breakfast during winter, a trend that, historians assure us, never really took off, despite the best efforts of dairy marketers through the ages. This was an era when Mother Nature decided to shake things up with her own impromptu performance, complete with snowstorms that could make even the hardiest of snowmen reconsider their life choices. Picture it, if you will, as a time before meteorologists had fancy gadgets and computer models. Instead, they had rheumatic knee joints and a habit of looking worriedly at the sky. The men and women responsible for weather reporting would bravely walk outside, squint at the horizon, and either mutter something about a bit nippy, which everyone understood meant to stock up on firewood and perhaps overcoats several sizes too large. One could never have too many layers back then. In the quaint little town of Chowderton-on-Thames, a name concocted by historians who loved their soup-related puns almost as much as they loved their historical accuracy, a particularly mischievous snowstorm descended with gusto. Yes, with gusto, for this snowstorm enjoyed making grand entrances. It swept in with the flair of an opera singer hitting the high notes, howling through the streets in a blustery area that had the nervous townsfolk bobbing their heads in exaggerated agreement from the safety of their homes. Due to an utter lack of modern convenience, or perhaps blessedly, depending on one's perspective, Chowderton-on-Thames became a picturesque canvas of snowdrifts and haphazardly abandoned carriages. Children, the eternal optimists, managed to turn this white wilderness into a Durham playground, their laughter mixing with the snow-laden air in a symphony that even the most somber adult found enchanting. Now, as history tends to work in mysterious ways, it was just after one of these snowy assaults that the town's very first winter weather advisory was penned, or rather, scrawled with inky fingers numbed by the cold. It came in the form of a public notice posted in the town square, urging the community to not dither about and to perhaps consider staying home before they turned into human icicles. The notice became legendary, not for its succinct advice, but because the postman's heavy wool coat churned out enough static to attract the nearest street cat, leading to a chase through town that brought warmth to the hearts of all who beheld the spectacle. Suffice it to say, this incident inadvertently led to the custom of delivering mail with great caution, and often with a small satchel of fish to appease any curious felines lurking nearby. As the snowstorms, theatrics continued to unfold, a young visionary named Horace Weatherby dreamed of a world where snow etiquette was more than a couple of icicles away. Horace, a humble cobbler known for suspect shoes but impeccable foot warmers, began musing about a time when people might be able to anticipate these grand displays from the skies. He imagined vivid maps drawn on heavy parchment, showing tiny arrows swirling about like well-choreographed dancers. Skeptics, however, rolled their eyes skyward, accomplishing 2 feats at once, dismissing Horace's wild ideas and checking for any ominous snow clouds. This budding notion of forecasting, fancy jargon for guessing tomorrow's weather, tickled the collective imagination like a brush of frosty air. The Romantic Age, thus named because even nature found it impossible not to wax poetic about its own theatrical tendencies, was unknowingly setting the stage for a scientific revolution that would arrive much later, eagerly forecasting our daily wardrobe choices with varying degrees of success. As Horace plodded through the snow-laden streets, dreaming of a snowcall that never came, the good folks of Chowderton-on-Thames realized that even amid the cold, wonders and whimsy could be found. They simply required a hearty dose of imagination, an appreciation for the humor of nature, and a willingness to share stories that would melt even the iciest of hearts. With a lull in the conversation, as gentle as a snowfall's whisper, we drift our thoughts to what winter's breath might have in store next, as history, with all its warmth and wonder, continues to unravel like a well-loved story. As twilight wrapped the world in its gentle grasp, the tale unfolded in the serene embrace of yesteryear, where history danced like snowflakes themselves, each flake both unique and the same in its cold embrace. We find ourselves now in the far reaches of a fledgling United States, gazing out over the sprawling Midwest, at a time when men seemed determined to settle anywhere they could be convinced not to leave. The locals were getting quite good at setting records: longest period without sun, highest number of complaints about frostbite, and the least accurate statements of "spring is just around the corner." In the midst of this charmingly frigid situation stood a man named Rufus Bickle, a name seemingly stitched together out of stern syllables and unintentional humor. Rufus was a postmaster in a small town, best known for its geographical proximity to nowhere. Here, in the early 19th century, he found himself not only challenged by the elements, but by a most peculiar societal expectation: the demand for daily mail delivery, come snow, wind, or complete loss of feeling in his extremities. You see, Rufus held the dubious honor of being the first official town weather advisor, crucible-tested by sheer survival odds and driven by the fear of disappointed townsfolk deprived of their gossip via mail. Rufus possessed an uncanny talent for reading the signs of impending doom in a landscape blanched to a monochrome vastness. The wisp of a certain kind of cloud, the way the wind flirted with the upper branches of a battered oak, even the private conversations of icicles communicating their pending weight loss. All these whispers of nature informed his forecasts. In the year of 1825, Rufus dealt with conditions so fierce they warranted expression beyond the solemn nods of New England. Townsfolk recalled the Big Chill, which wasn't a cinematic endeavor, but rather a contest between man and nature, where the prize for losing was frostbite, and the prize for winning was less frostbite. Rufus, in desperate measures to keep the spirits of his neighbors as high as the snowbanks, invented what could very generously be called the first winter weather advisory system. Imagine, if you will, the scene. Dear Rufus, atop the town's lone apple barrel, blowing into his hands like a beleaguered brass section and declaiming his weather predictions to an audience of bundled figures who looks like multicolored Russian dolls. He would begin with phrases that today would make meteorologists cringe with envy. "Beware the white shrouds of peril," Rufus would declare, his breath misting into fog. Prepare thy homes and selves, for the skies threaten an abundance of ill-tempered snowflakes with inquisitive winds. The townsfolk would nod sagely, as if they understood each allegorical reference, when in actuality they banked on Rufus's dry humor as much as his weather wisdom. A solid foot of snow might simply prompt nature's duvet returns, but with fewer goose feathers. Amazingly, Rufus's exhortations soon made him something of a local hero. His advisory system, albeit informal and often melodramatic, saved dozens of lives, or so the local whittlers' journals might tell you, though they were as blustery as any spring squall and twice as hard to decipher. One winter evening, after a particularly poetically pitched warning about a woolly mammoth of a storm, Rufus was approached by a small child who asked a rather existential question. When will it be spring? Rufus, without missing a beat, replied, "When the snow finally gets tired of itself, my child. Much like the rest of us." And with a gentle, amused chuckle, young and old reconciled themselves to the continued presence of winter's icy tyranny. As the fires burned low and the warmth seeped steadily into the grateful bones of the townsfolk, they lay their heads to rest, warmed by Rufus's humor and wisdom, both as necessary as thick quilts. His tales of endurance and environmental drollery wrapped them in a calming narrative, much like how a lingering fire tucks its sparks to sleep. And so, with snow still softly falling, hinting at more adventures of weatherly woes, we leave Rufus, his head full of clouds and a heart warmer than any hearth, knowing that each day was a small victory against the cold. Yet, in this careful pause before the next atmospheric caper, there lies a lesson whispered on the wind, smooth transitions written in snow and sound, waiting patiently until the morrow. As the 17th century bid farewell and the 18th century trotted in, majestically wrapped in a frosty demeanor that would make even Ice Age creatures don a cardigan, Europe found itself in the grip of a decidedly bitter embrace. It was a time when the concept of central heating was the cozy nook of someone's wild imagination, and goose feathers were more likely to escape from a pillow than to provide any real warmth. This chapter, my dear sleepy listener, guides us gently through the snow-laden alleyways of the harsh winters that began to plague the continent. Now, picture yourself in the year 1709, a year so cold that even the mighty Thames River had decided to take a winter nap beneath a thick sheet of ice. In what is now France, the mighty rivers Rhône and Seine followed suit, adopting a solid, crystalline demeanor, and Parmesan cheese wheels froze solid, proving that even cheese could suffer from a chill. It was in this frosty tableau that weather advisories took on an intimate urgency for the very first time, albeit in the format of hurriedly scribbled notes, courtesy of the town criers. "Beware the snow," they might have shouted, vigorously swinging their proclamations with the energy only a good woolen hat could bestow. Alas, the people knew the bite of winter well. To them, the snow wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a challenge to be met with knitted resolve. Consider for a moment the industrious peoples of the Low Countries who took the opportunity to hone their skating skills upon the frozen canals, transforming into effortlessly graceful human herons slicing the ice. Meanwhile, the dogged folks of northern Italy, faced with similarly harsh conditions, decided that what couldn't be cured must be endured, often quite literally, with excessive doses of hot espresso. You see, necessity was the mother of invention, and caffeinated survival became something of a cultural pastime. And in the quaint English village of Blizzardsworth-upon-Sleet, an unassuming apothecary named Barnabas Brittleton stumbled upon what would soon become a staple in wintertime comfort, the hot water bottle. Legend has it, he filled an animal bladder with warm water and tucked it into bed with himself, though rumors suggest his cat, Sir Puddington Fluffs, was the first actual beneficiary of this ingenious warmth-gathering device. We find that even before meteorologists and their dazzling satellite images graced our lives, this period witnessed communities forecasting their own ways. Some turned to almanacs, predicting the weather by the movement of stars and the behavior of animals, rather like a spectacular, cosmic guessing game. Others relied on more folkloric means. A red sky in the morning, for example, was a sailor taking warning, while Grandma Ethel's knees predicted tempest with admirable precision. In essence, though the winters were perilous, there was something fortifying about the shared adversity, a solidarity among the icy glances and snug firesides. Families huddled together, their breaths mingling with steam from hastily brewed teas. Stories were shared, traditions were forged, and communities grew closer, much like the sheep in Monsieur Chevalier's barn, who huddled together on particularly frosty nights to stay warm and dream of greener pastures and less bipedal company. And so, as the winds howled like an overachieving opera singer finding the perfect C-note, the seeds of what we would come to recognize as winter weather, advisories began to sprout in human consciousness. It's comforting to think how a small scribble on a parchment could have such a profound effect, guiding the villagers of old towards sensible precautions and quicker routes to the comforts of their own hearths. Let the gentle knowledge of these past winters warm you as you drift into the land of dreams, where snowy landscapes are but the powdered sugar on the sweet cake of peaceful slumber. As the tale begins to weave its way into your sleep, we shall soon wander into the warm embrace of history's next snowy insight. As our journey through the snow-blanketed past continues, we find ourselves in the realm of an alleged massive blizzard authority, established long before any televised weather channel dared use dramatic theme music and titles like Arctic Apocalypse. Picture, if you will, a group of reluctant participants seated on uncomfortable stools at the local tavern of Frosty Mug, in a small medieval village that has seen better summers. This motley crew, tasked with drafting the very first winter weather advisories, included grizzled shepherds who could interpret the sky like elder runes, and overzealous bakers whose flour-dusted windowsills doubled as makeshift weather stations. In those days, weather predictions were a bit like trying to predict the winner of a joust based on the combatants' horoscopes. It was a glorious art, mixed with just the right amount of whimsy and a pinch of wishful thinking. The marketplace rumblings would mingle with the snowflakes as townsfolk listened keenly to the town crier, who might have looked like he knew a fair bit about everything but actually specialized in having an awesomely resonant voice. Their first attempt to formalize warnings of impending doom went something like this. Hear ye, hear ye! A brisk winds of troubling temperature are expected to disturb thy livestock and pique thine struggle with the elements. Gather ye eggs and hay with urgency, afore all is lost under the wrath of the chilling squall. Granted, it was more poetic than practical, but it did the job. Villagers quickly exchanged knitted caps for thicker ones and solemnly celebrated the slightly warmer corner of the tavern, a minor victory against the relentless winter. It was, of course, the village cats who first became adept at sensing weather changes long before any advisory was considered, adjusting their sleeping positions to more sheltered spots whenever the air seemed too crisp for their liking. If the cats were found lingering near the hearth, it was considered prudent to check the pantry for enough beans and bacon, comfort foods when the cold would wrestle with the winds and win. Meanwhile, in noble halls, far from the common folk's winter worries, a delightful yet curious spectacle unfolded. Courtiers of King Rollo the Risk-averse were busy concocting extravagant inventions to keep the chill at bay. One such marvelous, yet fairly impractical, creation was a royal garment, the great warming cloak of ever-toastiness. This particular contraption required a small, portable fire, somehow affixed to it, resulting in scorched carpet threads more often than not. With each step, King Rollo swiftly demonstrated the concept of short-lived grandeur, as flames required the hurried attentions of his ever-patient courtiers armed with pillows and towels. And then there were the midnight storytellers, whose words wove warmth. On the longest nights, children would gather around these artisans of tales, whose narratives danced with mischief and delight, distracting young minds from the howling breaths of the winter storms. They would regale their audiences with stories of yore, of mythical beasts frozen in ice fields, and knights who challenged the snow itself to duels of chivalric charm and bravery. But the true magic lay in their ability to transform frosty realities into enchanting dreams, where no chill was unmanageable and no bread was overbaked. The lessons from these bygone winter woes were quietly setting the stage for what modern weather advisories would become, albeit they would feature less poetry and more statistics, less feeling, perhaps, and more figures. Yet even as we lean into digital forecasts, the spirits of those ancient messengers remain, hovering in the frosted whispers of winter's breath, reminding us of our shared human trembling at the sound of weather's whims. As we inch towards the final chapter of our snowy escapade, allow yourself to drift gently, like a snowflake, through the magic of old turning into the marvels of modernity, as the tale of winter's wondrous advisories softly nears its conclusion. As the story comes to a close on this final chapter, grab your cup of sleepy time tea and nestle into the coziest spot in your bed. We're about to drift into the final, snowflake-laden chapter of the deadly snowstorms that forced the first winter weather advisories. Picture, if you will, a sleepy 18th century village where every doorframe is dusted with a frosty trim and the windows are fogged over with the scatterings of 1,000 exhaled syllables of surprise. Inside the local tavern, rickety tables and creaky stools gather the townsfolk as cozy as marshmallows. Wedged into a hot chocolate, the smell of spiced mead swirling around like the delicate tendrils of snow that have become a second nature to them by now. Outside, the winter of 1784 swirled viciously, its icy fingers attempting to tickle the picnic baskets of the future, and its snowdrifts forming stockpiles larger than any Hamlet resident had ever thought necessary. Previously unused vocabulary, such as impassable and "where did I leave my horse?" became frighteningly regular parlance. The discerning folks here had learned the hard way. Not even the sturdiest of Wollongab could thwart the biting advances of this season's particularly vindictive winter. Picture young Ira Sneedworth, the town's unofficial scribe and occasional maker of cabbage soup. In a moment of divine inspiration, or perhaps delirium, after a particularly hearty portion of cabbage leaves, Ira decided it was up to him to create a forecast of warnings. The Empire had its reasons for being less than punctual about creating meteorological awareness. After all, diplomacy with neighboring lands apparently involved many tea-drinking sessions more important than weather predictions. Sitting at the corner of the tavern by a fire that crackled merrily, pretending to be hot, he scratched furiously at parchment with a quill that protested the labour as much as the feathered creature it once belonged to. "Hear ye," he thought to write, even though they all were more inclined towards snoozy murmuring instead of listening. "There's cumulative white cold stuff pending," Ira's ad hoc advisory proclaimed. Most onlookers understood Snow's wily predictability. They took one look out the window at a flurry that could rival the fiercest confectioner's sugar fiasco, and simply went back to discussing the shortage of rutabagas with the air of scholars at a vegetable conference. Nevertheless, Ira's public service announcement was revolutionary, pinning it to the much-frequented, peculiarly stationary bulletin board, known locally as Old Shelley, a nod to its stubborn resemblance to a local cow. The message may have been a bit esoteric for the average villager, but those who did heed it found themselves marginally less perplexed by the conditions outside their windows. These bucketfuls of advice weren't easy to come by. They required a knowledge of reading clouds that the aspiring meteorologist attained through tireless observation, occasionally misidentifying an owl for a cumulus formation. However, people began bringing Ira peculiarities as gifts, a particularly nimble quill here, a delightful jar of pickled turnips there. The villagers saw this as an investment. If the cabbage soup ran out, perhaps Ira's wisdom would tide them over or help them avoid tumbling down the great hill as a human-sized snowball. Ira's newly coined winter weather advisories soon became part of the fabric, a thickly woven one, mind you, of village life. This era wasn't just a passing snowy inconvenience. It was an affectionate reminder that sometimes resilience and a little creativity crafted mighty echoes through pages of history. The inhabitants took life, and the weather, in stride, wearing their new sage-like knowledge on patch sleeves like merit badges, always preferring warmth-induced naps over panicked pondering. The snowstorms that winter may have been challenging, like a patient tutor that patiently corrects your handwriting with long wintry lessons in endurance. Still, shimmering with a thin, icy glaze of humor, the people of the village learn to waltz through the seasons, together with a blend of wit, wisdom, and warm woolen socks. Now, as we draw the curtains on this blustery voyage through time, allow these echoes of history's cool embrace to lull you into a restful sleep. Here's to a night filled with dreams of soft snowfalls and warm, cozy hearth fires, inventors of tomorrow's tranquility, as you drift gently into the realm of peaceful slumber.